A few months ago, I had to go to Seoul to take care of some paperwork. I spent the entire day in meetings, and by the time everything was done, it was already late. My hotel was on the other side of the city, so I decided to save money by taking the subway to a nearby station. However, to get to the hotel, I had to cross the Mapo Bridge. I didn't know anything about its history at the time, so I didn't think much of it. It was late at night, around 11 p.m., and the bridge was practically empty. At first, crossing the bridge felt uneventful. The lighting was adequate, though slightly dim, and I just wanted to get to the other side as quickly as possible. But when I got to about the middle of the bridge, I started to feel something strange. It wasn't cold, but it was a sort of discomfort, like someone was walking behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there. Just the sound of the wind and the river below. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination and kept walking. That's when I heard it. The sound was faint, like a murmur, coming from somewhere behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind passing through the bridge's railings, but then it became clearer. It was voices. Not one, but several mixed together, as if multiple people were speaking at the same time. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like they were talking or worse, crying. I turned around again, expecting to see someone, but the bridge was still empty. By this point, I started walking faster. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, almost suffocating. That's when I felt it. A hand touched my left shoulder. It wasn't a light touch, it was firm, as if someone was trying to stop me. I spun around immediately, but again nothing. My heart was pounding. It felt like something was there with me, but invisible. I remembered reading once about how some people report feeling presences in places where tragedies have occurred. At that moment, I tried to push those thoughts away and kept walking, almost running. As I hurried to get away, I felt another touch, this time on my back, like a light push. The problem was, there was no one there. I almost tripped but kept moving, trying not to panic. Then I heard footsteps behind me. This wasn't something I imagined, it was real. Firm footsteps, synchronized with mine, but clearly belonging to someone else. I froze, and the footsteps stopped too. The silence that followed was even worse. My chest tightened, and my breathing grew heavy. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to finally see someone, but there was only the empty path behind me. That's when I noticed something strange. The bridge, which had been lit before, now seemed darker. The lights were dimming one by one, leaving me in a shadowy darkness that didn't make sense. My mind was racing. Each step felt harder, like my legs didn't want to carry me forward. I wanted to run, but something told me that if I did, things would only get worse. I tried to focus on the end of the bridge, where the light seemed brighter, but then I heard something that made me stop. It was a voice very close, like someone whispering in my ear. "Why are you still here?" I froze. I looked around, panicked, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from all directions at once. My chest was so tight I could barely breathe. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a shadow on the bridge's railing. It was a human figure, facing away from me, as if looking down at the river below. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and I knew that person hadn't been there before. I couldn't stop staring at the figure. Something about the way it stood there, motionless on the railing, made me tense. I thought about shouting or approaching, but before I could do anything, it moved. In a single motion, the figure climbed onto the railing and jumped. It happened so quickly that I only had time to take a step forward, shouting, "Hey!" I ran to the railing, my heart racing, and looked down at the river below. The water was calm, dark, reflecting only the distant city lights. There was no sound of impact, no movement on the surface. Nothing. I looked to both sides, trying to find some sign of the person, but it was as if they had never been there. I stepped back from the railing, my hands trembling. It didn't make sense. I was completely terrified. None of it made any sense. I looked around to see if anyone else was on the bridge, but it was still deserted. Just the distant sound of traffic and the wind over the river. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just seen. Am I so tired that I'm imagining things? I thought, trying to calm myself, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I decided to get out of there as fast as I could. I started walking toward my hotel, my steps quick and heavy, my body feeling weighed down with each step. Even as I moved away from the bridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me. The silence around me was so dense it only made my fear worse. When I finally reached the hotel, I went into my room, locked the door, and sat on the bed for hours, replaying that scene in my mind. The next day, I knew I needed to talk to someone about what happened. I told a coworker, only giving a few details at first, just mentioning that I saw someone on the bridge and that they disappeared. He looked at me seriously and asked, "Was this on the Mapo Bridge?" When I nodded, he shook his head and said, "You shouldn't have crossed that bridge at night." That's when he told me about the bridge's reputation. Mapo Bridge is known as the Bridge of Death because of the number of people who have taken their lives there. He said many believe that the spirits of those who died on the bridge are still trapped there. Some people say that if you're alone, you might feel touches, hear voices, or even see figures that vanish. That gave me chills. He advised me to avoid the bridge, especially at night. After that conversation, I started researching the bridge. I found stories in forums and news articles about the tragedies that happened there. People talked about hearing voices, seeing shadows, or even feeling like they were being pulled or pushed while walking alone. Many described situations similar to mine, figures appearing and disappearing without explanation. Each story I read only made me more convinced that something truly strange had happened to me that night. Since then, I've avoided even going near that bridge. I don't know what I saw or if it was some manifestation of the tragedies that occurred there. All I know is that the feeling of being watched, of something beyond my control, still lingers with me sometimes. No matter how much I try to forget, the sound of the wind that night and the moment that figure jumped keep replaying in my mind. If you're ever in Seoul, my advice is simple. Avoid Mapo Bridge, especially at night. This happened a few weeks ago when I had to travel to visit a client in the area. It was a long trip, so I left in the late afternoon, expecting to arrive at night. The problem was that, due to delays with my previous appointments, I ended up taking an unfamiliar route on GPS, which led me onto a road that seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. The road was narrow and poorly lit, surrounded by tall trees on both sides. I was tired but stayed alert because the area was deserted and the road was full of curves. The only thing breaking the silence was the sound of the radio. That's when I saw her. A figure in white appeared in the middle of the road, right in my lane, just a few meters ahead. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded, nearly veering off the road. My heart was racing as I pressed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop just a few meters away from the figure. It was a woman, dressed in white, standing in the middle of the road. The headlights illuminated her, but her face was partially hidden by her hair. For a moment, I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. Everything around me seemed unnervingly silent, as if the world had stopped with me. Instinctively, I felt compelled to get out of the car to understand what had just happened. Grabbing my phone, I stepped out and walked cautiously toward where the woman had been. But there was nothing there. No sign of anyone, no footprints, no movement in the trees around me. The place was empty. My chest tightened, and with each passing second, I felt an overwhelming urge to leave as quickly as possible. I rushed back to the car, locked the doors, and hit the gas, determined not to look back. As I drove, I tried to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing added up. My body was so tense I could barely move. Out of habit, I glanced in the rearview mirror, thinking I might see the woman on the road again, and reassure myself that I hadn't imagined everything. It was a stupid decision. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her face partially hidden by her hair, just like before. Her head was tilted to the side, and her dirt-covered hands seemed to be clutching something. I was so startled I nearly lost control of the car. I jerked the steering wheel to avoid going off the road and barely missed hitting a tree. When I finally managed to stop the car, I turned to look at the back seat again, but it was empty. My breathing was heavy, and sweat was dripping down my back. That was the moment I realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just my imagination or exhaustion. I needed to get out of there as fast as I could. I pressed the gas pedal and drove on, but the farther I went, the more the road seemed endless. The trees all looked the same, and the scenery around me never changed. I glanced at the GPS, but it wasn't loading. I tried restarting it, but it was useless. Even my phone had no signal. I started to feel like I was driving in circles, or worse, that I was trapped on that road. The tension in the car was unbearable. I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see something. With the GPS and phone not working, even the radio had gone silent. The quiet around me grew oppressive, amplifying my fear. My only goal was to get off that road before something worse happened. The more I drove, the more it felt like I was stuck in an endless loop. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, even though I couldn't see anything in the mirrors or around me. I decided to pull over for a moment to try to calm down. My entire body was tense, and my hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I grabbed my phone again, but it still had no signal. I looked around, trying to recognize anything familiar, but everything was the same: tall, dark trees and an empty road. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I knew I wasn't alone. It sounded like muffled laughter, coming from the back seat. My heart raced. I turned around quickly, but once again, there was no one there. The silence returned, but the feeling that something was in the car with me didn't go away. I started the engine again and drove off, trying to get away as fast as possible. I didn't even know if I was going in the right direction anymore. I just wanted to leave. The road seemed to stretch on forever. Then I noticed something ahead. There was a flickering light in the distance. My chest eased slightly. Maybe it was a gas station or another car. But as I got closer, I realized it was a figure standing in the middle of the road. My body froze. It was her again. The same woman in white, motionless, her hair covering her face. This time, I didn't wait to figure it out. I turned the wheel sharply, veered onto the shoulder, and sped off without looking back. After swerving to avoid the figure, I didn't stop again. I pressed the accelerator so hard my hands ached from gripping the wheel. All I wanted was to find any sign of civilization, anything to get me off that road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a sign indicating an exit. I didn't hesitate and followed it. When I reached a more urban area, I pulled into a small gas station. The attendant gave me a strange look as I walked in to buy a bottle of water. Probably because of my state, I was sweating and shaking. I asked if he knew the road I had come from. He replied, "You should avoid that area at night. There are stories about accidents, people disappearing." He didn't say anything else, but that was enough. After that night, I promised myself I would never take that road again. I still think about that woman and what happened. I don't know if it was some kind of hallucination or if there's something truly trapped in that place. That was a few years ago, back when I was an exchange student in South Korea. The school I attended was large and old, with long hallways and restrooms that always seemed a bit eerie. I'd always heard rumors that one of the second-floor bathrooms was haunted, but like everyone else, I thought it was just a story to scare the newcomers. One afternoon, I was in the library studying for an exam and lost track of time. When the bell rang to signal that the building was closing, I realized I needed to use the restroom before leaving. The closest one happened to be the second-floor bathroom. When I went in, the place was silent, except for the sound of my boots on the ceramic floor. The lights were on but flickered occasionally, as if they had a bad connection. I chose one of the stalls in the middle, locked the door, and tried to be quick. But while I was in there, I heard a noise coming from the other stalls. At first, I thought it was the sound of the pipes or the building settling, but it soon became clear that it was footsteps. Someone had entered the restroom, but the sound of their steps was strange, slow and dragging, as if the person was walking with difficulty. I hurried to finish and stepped out of the stall, but when I looked in the mirror, there was no one behind me. I found it odd because I was sure I had heard footsteps heading toward the entrance. I glanced around at the other stalls, checking them one by one, and all were empty. That's when I heard something, a low sobbing sound, coming from one of the corner stalls. The crying was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was impossible to ignore. It came from the last stall, way in the corner of the bathroom. I froze, unsure of what to do. There had been no one when I entered, and all the stall doors had been open. But now, the door to that last stall was closed. My heart started racing, and my instincts told me to run, but something made me stay. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the fear of imagining things. With slow steps, I approached. The crying grew clearer. It was feminine, desperate, like someone completely lost or in pain. "Hey, is everything okay in there?" I asked, trying to sound calmer than I felt. There was no answer, just the continuous sound of sobbing. My hand trembled as I touched the stall door. I pushed it slowly, and it opened with a long, creaking sound. The space was empty. No one was inside. At that moment, my body froze. The restroom was completely empty, but the sound of crying continued. It wasn't coming from the stall anymore. It seemed to be echoing throughout the restroom, as if it were everywhere at once. My heart started pounding, my legs began to shake, and I could barely breathe. I looked around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, but there was no explanation. Then something caught my attention in the mirror. When I looked, for a brief second, I saw a reflection that wasn't mine. Behind me, in the corner of the bathroom, there was a figure, dark hair covering its face, wearing a soaked school uniform, as if it were dripping wet. I spun around immediately, but when I looked at the corner, there was nothing there. When I turned back to the mirror, the reflection was gone too. I was trying to make sense of what was happening, but my mind couldn't process it in that moment. My whole body was trembling, and the feeling that something was there with me only grew stronger. The crying suddenly stopped, leaving the bathroom in complete silence. I looked at the mirror again, hoping it was over, but that's when I heard it. A faint voice, almost a whisper, coming from behind me. My legs locked up at that moment. I didn't want to turn around, but something compelled me to glance over my shoulder. There was no one there, just the empty space, the lined-up stalls, and the bathroom door slightly ajar. As I started backing toward the exit, the light flickered, and I heard the sound of a stall door slamming shut. I looked in the direction of the noise, but all the doors were open, exactly as before. I just wanted to get out of there. I could barely breathe at this point. The exit door was right there, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Then the sound started again, but this time closer. It wasn't crying or laughter. It was the sound of bare feet on the wet floor, coming toward me. My hands were trembling so much that I could barely grab the door handle. When I finally managed to turn it, the light flickered again. In the last flicker, I saw in the mirror a figure standing behind me. It was the same girl as before. She opened her mouth as if to say something, and that was enough for me. I yanked the bathroom door open, so hard I almost lost my balance. I ran down the empty hallway of the school without looking back. My only goal was to get out of there. I ran all the way home and couldn't sleep that night. After that, I never went back to that bathroom. Some classmates said they had heard strange sounds there too, like laughter or the sound of a door slamming when no one was around. But no one has been able to explain what it is. To this day, I avoid mirrors in empty bathrooms, especially when I'm alone.
Hello. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. This helps us grow and bring even more new content. Thank you, and see you next time.